Although we only mentioned trumpets in the title of this lecture, in fact I'm going to talk about a whole range of different wind instruments. And the key point that I want to make that lies behind almost everything we're saying today is that there's been a remarkable sort of interaction between the way the instruments have been developed by instrument makers, the way players have developed their skills in performance, and the way composers have used all the new developments in their music. So there's been a kind of three-way partnership. I'd like to begin by just reminding you of one or two of the properties of simple tubes, because in the 1920s and 30s in elementary physics labs people did experiments on tubes, and of course we've learned a lot since then. But the sort of thing that we start with, if you think of this as the air in a pipe, and I send a pulse down it, the pulse comes back again. And if we keep on doing that, we end up with a vibration like that. And I think you can see that there's a point at the middle where nothing much is happening. We call it a node. And we would call that the first mode or pattern of vibration of that tube. Now, if I make it go faster, I think you can probably see that there are three places where nothing much is happening. Well, that's the sort of thing that we start with, a number of patterns or modes of vibration, and each one has a characteristic frequency or pitch. And I'm going to shock some of my physicist colleagues by referring to those notes as harmonics. They're only really harmonic if their frequencies go in the ratio 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And they very rarely do in mechanical systems, but because it's convenient, I'm going to call all the extra notes that we can get harmonics. The other thing I'd like to remind you of is how we can set a pipe vibrating. If I take just a little piece of straw like that and put my thumb on the bottom and just blow across it, I can get a note. And what's happening there is that the air is hitting the back edge of the tube, and we've got it getting what we call edge tones or eddies, which are oscillating backwards and forwards, and it's a relatively smooth way of getting the pipe to oscillate. Now, if instead of that I take a piece of straw that's been flattened at the end, it becomes a reed, and that will open and shut and give much harsher vibrations. You can tell it's quite loud and harsh, and every time it opens a little pulse of air goes through. Well, those are the sort of basic, simple ideas. Now, another way to demonstrate the sounds that we sometimes call harmonics is to use tubes like this. I'm sure some of you, a few years ago, played with them. They have various names. If I just whirl this tube round, I think you can hear that we're getting various notes. Would somebody like to come and help me? Oh, I think perhaps you had your hand up first. Would you like to take that one and see if you can whirl it round and make some notes for me? Doesn't seem to work, does it? Would you like to try that one instead? Ah, that's got it, yes. Now, I wonder if you'd like to have a look and see if you can tell me why you think one does and the other doesn't.
That one's got stuff inside.
That's right, that's got a bung inside it, so the air won't go through. Thank you very much. Okay. Yes. See, what's happening is that as I rotate it, the air is rushing through, coming out at the end, and as it rushes through, it hits these little corrugations. It doesn't work with a smooth tube, and actually the physics of it is very complicated, but roughly, as the air hits these, it will set up vibrations. And if they happen to match one of the modes or harmonics of the pipe, we shall hear the note. But of course, if we put a cork in the tube, no air can go through, so we don't get any oscillation. Well, now, it's difficult to blow those. You would think you might be able to blow air through them, but that's not easy. So we've developed this device. If I just pull this up here, you can hear that we're getting the notes. Now let me just show you what I'm doing. This is an oil can with no bottom, and I've got water in the tank. And so when I lower this into the tank, we're getting the air rushing through in just the same way, and so we're producing the modes of the pipe or the harmonics. So that would probably be a slightly easier way to produce sounds. But you could hardly call that a real musical instrument. What I want to start talking about now are the group of instruments that we tend to call the lip reed instruments. I talked about the reed made of straw there, but many instruments, all the brass instruments, for example, use the lips as the reed. And this is the first one I want to talk about. This comes from Australia. It's used by the Aboriginal people there. This is a didgeridoo. And what I have to do is to make my lips flap, that sort of thing. And if I can get my lips going at the right speed, which is not easy because I'm not a didgeridoo player, but let's just try it and see. Now, I soon run out of breath. Now, if you're a real didgeridoo player, what you do is what is called circular breathing. You breathe in through your nose while you're blowing out through your mouth. And I find that incredibly difficult, but nevertheless, that's what you have to do. Now, if we look at the end of this pipe, I think we shall see that it isn't just a plain tube all the way through. In fact, you can probably see that there's a constriction. And in fact, at the end here, it's quite wide, and it tapers down, and then it widens out again, and the rest of it is hollow. And that is really a primitive mouthpiece, like the mouthpieces on all these brass instruments. So even though it looks as though it hasn't got a mouthpiece, it actually has, but it's tucked away inside. Well, now, we're going to move to a slightly more conventional, though not completely conventional instrument, and that's this one. This is just 8 feet of brass tubing, and I'm simply going to see if I can produce some notes from it. And we can produce a sequence of notes which, well, not very much in tune, but they're all modes of the pipe. Let's try it just once more. We can get a whole sequence of notes, and what's happening there is, of course, that by making my lips vibrate at different frequencies, I can excite different modes of vibration in the pipe. Well, now, if you start thinking about what happens in a simple tube, which is what people tended to do in the 1920s and 30s, and try to extend it to instruments like this, you get some surprises. And you find that things don't seem to work out as you think they ought. And so often it is the case in these sort of situations that you're not really comparing like things. And of course, really, this instrument here, which we'll talk a bit more about later, is nothing like a straight tube. And so it's not really surprising that it does different things. Well, let me just remind you of something that I've said before, and that is that if we have air in a pipe, and I want you to imagine that these trucks are the air, lumps of air, if you like, in a pipe, and the pipe is open at both ends. We haven't got anything there, and we've got nothing there. And if I send a squash along there, if I squash up this spring, when it gets to the end, that truck will shoot off, and so what will be sent back along it will be an expansion. So a compression becomes an expansion. We'll see if we can get that to work. I'll send the compression down, and then did you see the expansion goes back, and then it goes up and down several times. On the other hand, if I move the truck right up to the buffers like that, and I'm going to hold that there. Now if I send a compression down, it will come back as a compression. I think you could see that fairly plainly. Now we're going to look at some graphics to see if we can, it'll help us to understand what is going on in a tube. This tube is open at both ends. This fuzzy blob represents a compression. And when we send it down the tube, when it gets to the end, because the end is open, it changes into an expansion. And so what I've got to do to keep the oscillation going is every time the expansion comes back, I've got to match a pulse to the compression going down again. And so I can keep that going more or less indefinitely, and that would be the fundamental frequency of this particular tube. Now, if instead of sending it every time, if just as the compression gets down to the bottom and changes into an expansion, we send another pulse down, we shall see that they cross over in the middle. And what I've got to do now is to send twice as many pulses. Every time one of the expansions gets to this end, I've got to send another compression. You can see that when they get to the middle, they will cancel each other out, and that corresponds to a node. And I shall be operating at twice the fundamental frequency. If you like, that's the second harmonic. Now I'd like to turn to a tube that is closed at one end. Now this time, the compression will stay a compression until it gets back to this end. So let's see what happens there. There's the compression, and now it becomes an expansion, and now a compression. And I think you can see that if I'm going to keep that going, I've only got to send a compression down at that point, and then let it go on its own, and then send another one there. So I'm actually sending compressions at half the rate. If I sent one down at the speed of the previous one, I'd be sending a compression on top of an expansion and nothing would happen. And so this means that the fundamental frequency for a pipe that's open at one end and closed at the other is going to be exactly half the natural frequency of an open pipe. And that means also, of course, that if we're looking at the various harmonics that can be produced, we can't have any harmonics that are even. We can't have the second and the fourth and so on. We can only have the first and the third and the fifth. Well, now matters get even more complicated because if you think of a child on a swing, and suppose we're going to push. If we push just at the right moment, we can build up quite a big swing. We can build up a swing by resonance. But I don't have to push every time. I could push every second time, or every third time, or every fourth time. And of course, if I'm pushing every fourth time, I'm only operating at a quarter of the frequency. And it turns out that this is exactly the kind of thing that can happen with a real pipe. And I'm going to show you rather a lot of numbers now, but don't worry too much about the numbers. It's the principle of the thing that we're concerned with. If we start with a pipe closed at one end with a natural frequency of 240, the next harmonic we can get is 3 times that, not twice, and then 5 times, and then 7 times, and then 9 times. Well, now I've just said that we could push every alternate swing. So we could divide all these by 2, and we ought to be able to get those frequencies. And then if we divide by 3, we ought to be able to get those. And then by 4, and then by 5, and then by 6. And all those frequencies will be possible. Don't worry about all the numbers, just imagine that there are a lot of possible frequencies. Now you'll notice that some of them occur several times. So we're going to actually take those out and put them down at the bottom. There are 3 lots of 240. And then there are obviously 2 lots of 120. There are 2 lots of 360, 2 lots of 720. Now if we rearrange all that and put them in a block, I think we shall find that we have rather an interesting sequence. As I say, don't worry about all the different numbers that we're facing you with. We'll just build up the table. This is in sequence from the bottom upwards. And the thing that I want you to notice is that we started with 240, and we've got some very, very low frequencies that are there. And we've also got some high ones. So there are lots and lots of frequencies that, in principle, we ought to be able to get. They won't all be equally strong. Well, now, the idea of these frequencies was first really brought to our attention by an American physicist called Art Benade, who unfortunately died rather young, only a couple of years ago, but he did some marvellous work, and he invented the name privilege frequencies for all these additional numbers. He also invented another term which is very useful in talking about the way these sort of instruments work, and that is the recipe. He talked about the recipe of the components inside an instrument. And I'm going to use this synthesizer to produce some notes. If I start with a low note, you can see on the frequency analyzer here, and we've also brought up the oscilloscope. I'll have to stop talking because the microphone is picking up my voice. And then if I go to the second harmonic, you can see there the second lot on the analyzer, and you can see how the waveform is different. Now if we go to the third, and the fourth. Now if I bring them in one by one, you can still hear them going on, but if I bring them in all together, it just sounds like a rather rich tone. Well, we could go all the way up. And that's the first 10 of the harmonics, and if I just pick any group at random, that would be the recipe, the particular harmonics that are there and how strong they are. So that's what we mean by a recipe, and I shall talk about that from time to time. Well now, on the bench here we've got 3 real instruments, and it so happens that if we were to unwind this tenor trombone, or if we unwound this baritone horn, or if we unwound this euphonium, they would all turn out to be exactly the same length, give or take an inch or two, and in fact they'd be exactly the same length as the big brass tube that I brought in a moment ago. So we're going to bring the brass tube in again, and I'm going to blow a steady note on it, and we'll be able to see the recipe on the frequency analyzer and the wave pattern on the oscilloscope. Well, I think you can see that we had a fairly simple wave pattern and not all that many of these components present, 2 or 3 fairly heavy ones and not too many more. Well, now we're going to have a look at these instruments, and I think Charles, where is he? He's going to come and, there he is, he's going to come and play the trombone for us. Now perhaps you'd like, just to start with, perhaps you'd like to just give us a little glissando, the thing the trombone is famous for. Is it stuck? Oh dear. That's it. I think that's a lovely sound, isn't it? Now perhaps you could give us a steady note and we look at the recipe and the waveform. Now I think you can see that we've got far more of these components, a much more complicated recipe, and we've got a more complicated pattern. Would you like to give us another glissando just to finish with? Thank you very much, that's lovely. Well, now the other instrument we're going to look at is the euphonium, and I'm going to ask Matthew if he'll come and play that for us. Perhaps you could just play a few notes for us first of all. Fine, okay. Now, can we have a steady note and let's see what this looks like. Well, I think you can see that that is a simpler pattern than the trombone. Can we do it just once more? Just lovely, thank you very much indeed. It's not easy to hold a steady note like that. Well done. Well, all those recipes are quite different, and we really need to think just a little bit about why they're different. There's a little section of my original 8-foot tube. Nothing very interesting there, but if you compare it with little sections of the same length of these instruments, you can see how the diameter is changing enormously. So obviously the changes in diameter are one of the factors. And you could imagine that the mass of air in this little bit will be far less than the mass of air in a chunk of one of these instruments. And that's obviously going to have an effect. And the mass is changing as we go along. Well, now, one of the key things about all these instruments is that they have both a mouthpiece and a flare. And as soon as you take a simple tube, like my 8-foot straight tube, and put a mouthpiece on it, you immediately change its behavior, because the mouthpiece, I'll take this mouthpiece. The mouthpiece is like a little cup, and you could imagine that it's a little resonator, a little volume, which will have a frequency of its own. And as soon as you put that on the pipe, what it does is it begins to lower some of the higher components that are present. And then when we put a flare on the end, each of these instruments, as you can see, has a flare on the end. And what that does is to raise some of the lower partials. So if you start off with some elementary physics and you work out that a pipe like this, with my lips at one end or with the lips of the player at one end, is really a closed pipe, and you work out what you think the frequencies are going to be, in practice you find they're not. And you get a much bigger series of overtones or harmonics, because the mouthpiece and the bell have changed the basic principles. Well, now the flare also does something else. Inside the instrument, we have a particular sort of condition. In fact, we have a very, very loud sound in most of these. If you take the trumpet, for example, only about 1% of the energy that the player is putting in actually gets out at the end. All the rest is buzzing around inside. So you can tell that it's, if you are able to get inside, if you were small enough to get inside, you would pretty well be deafened. And what the bell does is to ease that sound out, as it were. And we talk about what we call the impedance of a pipe or an instrument. I'm sure some of you have heard of electrical impedance. If you apply a very high voltage to something which has a high impedance, you only get quite a small current. But if, on the other hand, you have something which has a low impedance, you can apply a low voltage and still get a very high current. Well, the same thing happens acoustically. If you have a high pressure and not much flow of air, we have a high impedance sort of system, and the lips tend to be that kind of system. And if you have the opposite, you have a low pressure and a lot of air movement, you have a low impedance system. Now, I think Claire is going to bring her oboe down, because the oboe is a very good example of a high impedance system. If you'd like to come and stand out here, what I'm going to ask Claire to do is to play just a few notes, whatever you like, for a little while, in one breath. And then I want you to watch her very carefully and see what she does when she finishes playing and takes the readout. Okay, thank you very much. Now, did you notice at the end, what did she do? She breathed out, didn't she? She didn't take a deep breath in, she breathed out. And the reason is that what she was doing all the time she was playing was producing high pressure and not much wind coming out. So the oboe is a high pressure and a low flow instrument. Thank you very much indeed, that was great. Now, if we take an instrument like a recorder or a flute, you can hear that it's not very well in tune, because I wasn't blowing very steadily. But you probably noticed that I wasn't really putting much effort into it at all. In fact, at the end, I would take a breath in. If you think about those of you who play recorders, I'm sure there are large numbers of you. When you've finished playing a phrase, you take a breath in. So that's a low impedance device. So what does the flare do? Well, the flare matches the impedance of what's going on inside here to the impedance outside. And you might think that the best thing to have would be an enormous flare, so big that it would completely match the impedance and all the energy would come out. But that wouldn't be any use at all, because if all the energy comes out, there'd be nothing coming back to the player, and the player would never actually be able to set up an oscillation. So we need a compromise, and this is what most of the instruments are. Well, now, of course, if the flare is so important in determining what goes back, it's obviously going to be important if you actually put anything inside the flare. And I think James is going to come and play the trumpet for us just briefly. And then when he's played a couple of notes on the trumpet, we're going to put this mute in the end, and you'll see what an enormous difference it makes to the quality of the sound. Now, if you'd like to put the mute in, I think you'll have to hold it probably. You can hear it's like an echo, isn't it, from a long way off. Thank you very much indeed, that was great. Pity we can't keep some of these people a bit longer and hear more notes. Now, with the French horn, I'm sure you've noticed that when a player is using a French horn, he or she puts a hand inside the bell. And you may have thought that was just a convenient way of holding it. But it isn't. In fact, what the player is doing with his hand or her hand is actually controlling the feedback, as it were, controlling what is happening. And you can actually change the quality of sound quite a bit. So you can see that real brass instruments are really quite a lot different from simple tubes. I'd like to just go back for a moment to the history of brass instruments, and one of the earlier ones is this. It doesn't look brass, but it's usually called a brass instrument because it uses a lip reed. This is a cornet, C-O-R-N-E-T-T, and it's played rather like the other brass instruments, but instead of using valves, as we shall see later on, you use finger holes to change the pitch. Now, it's an extremely difficult instrument to play, and I'm not, in fact, going to attempt it. But here is its big brother. This is the serpent, which is a lower pitch of the same kind of instrument. And I might just have a blow at this to see what I can do. It again has finger holes, and we can get, if I just keep the finger holes closed, I can produce a number of sounds. So there are a sequence of sounds you can get, and if you want to fill up the gaps, you have to use the finger holes. A little bit shaky, but nevertheless we got there in the end. Now, the problem with those two instruments is that they haven't got a flare, so we've got no matching. And of course, if you were to put a flare on an instrument with holes in it, it would only really work for the bottom note. So they tend to be very muffled instruments. Now, in the early days of trumpets, before valves were invented, they were just more, well, some of them were in fact straight and some were coiled up, but they only could produce what I've been calling harmonics. And let me just remind you briefly that if we go over to the synthesizer again, if I play the fundamental and the second and the third harmonic, they're quite a long way apart in pitch. But if I go up to the 8th, 9th and 10th, they're quite close together. So if you're using an ordinary trumpet without any valves, you can't play down at that position because, except for bugle calls or something of that kind, you have to play right up at the top. And there you can play tunes. Well, now, in the days of the great Johann Sebastian Bach, we only had the so-called natural trumpet. And I want to play you a little bit of a recording of Bach's second Brandenburg Concerto. And in that, the instruments take the tune in turn, and you'll hear a recorder play a little bit. But every time you come to the trumpet has to go right up high because it can't play down in the ordinary sort of range. That's the trumpet right up at the top. There's a recorder. trumpet again, right up high. Well, now, round about the end of the 18th century, the first valves were invented. The earliest one was invented by a man called Wedinger, and I think it was about 1796. And very soon after he'd invented valves, which would enable trumpet players to fill in the gaps, the composer Haydn wrote a concerto for a trumpet. And I want to play you just a little bit of one of the cadenzas from that concerto, and I think you'll see straight away that the trumpet can come down lower, and also it can do all sorts of much more flexible things that the valveless trumpet couldn't do. Well, obviously, there was a case where the invention of a new device, a valve, really influenced the music, and so it goes on, the instrument makers influencing the composers and so on. Well, now, you've all seen valves on an instrument. You just press these things down and you're adding a little bit of pipe. And we've got a graphic here. This is a rather representational view of a sort of tuba. And we've got some valves, and we've got little bits of extra pipe here. Now, if we press this middle valve, you see how immediately the air takes a longer path. And if we press this valve, the air takes an even longer path. And so you can see what's happening as you press the valves. This one would put the note down a semitone, and this one would put it down a tone and a half, 3 semitones. These others are more complications that I'm not going to talk about today. So, we've reached the point of seeing how valves are invented. What the player has to do, of course, is it's no use just pressing the valve and hoping the note will be right. The player has to immediately adjust to the particular set of valves that are pressed. And so all the time the player is actually producing the right frequency to match the trumpet. Well, now my friend Richard Smith here, Dr. Richard Smith, is not only a physicist, but he also happens to be a very good trumpet maker. And we're going to bring in one of the gadgets that he's invented. He's a trumpet maker who has in fact made trumpets for the Halle Orchestra, I think. Is that right?
That's right.
Yes, fine. Now this is a device which will play this trumpet electronically. What he's got is a little loudspeaker which is sending pulses down rather like the lips of the player, but there's also a microphone in the end, and the microphone is coupled up to this, well, we'll just call it a computer, shall we, for the sake of argument, and the computer tests the frequency that the pipe is set at and adjusts the loudspeaker to give the right frequency. In other words, it's doing what the brain would do. So can we now demonstrate what happened? It might be as well to make it just a little louder.
Put the sound through the amplifier. Middle valves semitone down. First valve 2 semitones. 2 valves together give 3 semitones.
So you can hear that the loudspeaker there is immediately adjusting. So the computer here is doing what the player's brain would have to do, probably doing it rather more quickly. Yes. Now, here's another gadget that Richard has invented, which I think is quite remarkable.
Fun.
It's for fun,
Just
yes.
for fun.
We've got the same gadget at the end, but instead of the trumpet, we've now got a rubber hose. Do we want to make this a bit louder? So there you see, you don't need valves, you don't need slides for the trombone, you just need a rubber tube.
Simple.
Simple. Thank you very much indeed, Richard. That's splendid. Well, now, just to further confuse the issue, to show you that just as you think you're beginning to understand the physics, somebody comes along and cuts the ground from under your feet. I'd like to introduce another friend of mine, Dr. John Bauscher, and he, in fact, is a physicist as well, but he's also a trombone player. And he's going to do something that I think is almost impossible. He's first of all going to do a glissando, the sort of thing that was done earlier for us, but he's not going to use the slide. He's just going to do it with his lips. Now that's impossible. And now he's going to do the converse. He's going to do a slide, but he's going to keep the note absolutely constant. I find it so difficult to believe. Could you do it again for us, just to show us?
May not be quite the same this time.
Never mind. Pretty good. I wish I had as much breath. And now finally, you remember I was talking about privileged frequencies, and we had a whole lots and lots of numbers on here, starting with some very low ones. Well, John is now going to demonstrate that for us. We're going to start with, what is it, a scale of E flat, is it?
You're yes, the bottom note of a tenor trombone is normally held to be E. So I will play the scale of E flat, a semitone lower, going downwards.
And still get the bottom note. Well, now, you see, it just defeats all the signs, doesn't it? But those bottom notes, the last octave that John was playing, were all the privileged frequencies, you see, which are all fractions of the various harmonics. So I think those demonstrations help us very much to understand a little bit more about what exactly is going on inside. Well, now I want to switch to the woodwind. And I think Robin, is it? Yes, Robin is going to play a little bit of clarinet for us. He's going to stand here, and we'll have a look at the analyzer and the oscilloscope. And if you could, well, just play a few notes first of all. That's fine. Now, could you play a steady note for us? And I think you can see that there are quite a lot of gaps. There are some really quite pure harmonics there. Just do it once more and let's have a look at the... And if you can see, I think, that the oscilloscope trace is relatively simple. Thank you very much indeed, that's great. Well, no, I'm not going to play the clarinet, I'm just going to make some notes with it. If I just play that note and then remove the bell, it doesn't really make much difference. And in fact, if I bung up the end, it doesn't make much difference. Because, of course, the sound isn't coming out of the end, it's coming out of the side holes, these holes here. And the reason we have a bell on the end is really to cope with what would happen if I was just playing the bottom notes. Ideally, I suppose, we ought to have a little bit of tube on there with 1 or 2 extra holes in, but that would look rather silly. So, in fact, we put the bell on instead. Well, this is just a piece of plastic tubing with a clarinet reed on the end of it. No holes. I'm going to play it. And we get a rather dull sort of note. But if I take the reed off that one and substitute this one, which has 5 holes drilled in it, you would expect it to give a note similar to this one because this tube is about the same length as the length to the first hole. I put the reed on the end and play this one. And I think you can tell that the 5 holes are making quite a big difference. It sounds rather more like a clarinet, though still not as good as a real clarinet. Now what I'm going to do is to use this tube here that has 3 holes. So we have one with no holes and one with 5 holes, and now we've got one with 3 smaller holes. And we might expect that the behavior of the middle one with 3 holes would be somewhere intermediate between the other 2. But you can probably tell from the tone of voice in which I'm saying that it's going to be something a little different. In fact, if I play this one, this tube just will not play. Doesn't matter how I try, I can't get a note out of it. But if I cover up the 3 holes, I can get a note. But as soon as I take my fingers off the holes, the note dies. And the reason is that these holes are in exactly the wrong place. They've been chosen to be at such a position that the sound reflected back inside from each of them more or less wipes itself out, and the reed just stops vibrating. So there's a lot more to a clarinet than simply having the holes in the right place to play tunes. This is a Baroque clarinet, and if I put it like that, I think you can probably see the 6 finger holes here and 1 or 2 keys. And if I put my clarinet alongside that, you can probably see that the holes on this clarinet have, all of them except that one, have keys. They're performing the same function as these holes, but they're bigger holes, and they've got all this complicated key work. Now, the key work has been through a lot of evolutionary stages, and this one, I think, is mainly the work of a manufacturer called Böhm. But there are a lot of other people who've made key systems, and I was always under the impression that one of the things the key system did was to make it easier to play smooth glides and things of that sort. And I stated this on one occasion, and I was pulled up by a clarinet player who said that he could play, well, for example, the opening glissando of Rhapsody in Blue more easily on a Baroque clarinet like this one than he could on a modern clarinet. Well, now I'd like to turn just briefly to another of the woodwind instruments, the bassoon, and I think Caroline has got her bassoon with her. And there are a number of things that are important about the bassoon, as with any instrument. But the first thing I want Caroline to do is just to play a few notes for us so we can hear what the bassoon sounds like. Splendid, thank you very much. Now, perhaps you could just play a fairly low note for us, and we'll have a look at the recipe and the oscillograph trace. Now, that note is somewhere down there. Could you just do it once more for us? And I think you can see that a lot of the energy, thank you very much, a lot of the energy is in the higher harmonics. And the interesting part about that is that you're playing a lot of those high harmonics, and our brains are saying, now, if the high harmonics are there, then there must be a fundamental somewhere. And although it isn't there, or nearly not there, our brains invent it. And this is yet another of the marvelous things that the ear-brain system does. Well, now, the other thing I'd like to show you on the bassoon is the wing system here. You probably notice that this is rather thicker than the rest. And can you see the 3 finger holes? Now, if Caroline puts her fingers on them, you can see that she can easily reach them. And yet, because the bassoon is so much bigger than the oboe, you'd expect the holes to be much further apart. and it would be very difficult for her to reach them. So what they've done is to drill the holes at an angle. This is an X-ray photograph of, this is the bassoon, and this is the X-ray photograph. Those are the positions of the 3 holes where Caroline's fingers go, and these are the positions inside, and you can see the sloping drilling, which means that you can stretch, in effect, your fingers to match where the holes want to be musically without having to stretch physically. And in order to do that, this bit of the bassoon had to be made much thicker. And then when they did that, they found that the tone actually changed. So although there are other ways of doing it, that has persisted. Thank you very much indeed, that's fine. Well now, finally, I want to think about what is probably the greatest of all the wind instruments, and that is the pipe organ. And this is a very important organ. This was built for Lord Rayleigh, who was a great physicist who worked here in the 19th century. In fact, he was the first of, I think, about 15 Nobel Prize winners to have worked in this institution. And he made this little organ in order to do some work on the physics of organ pipes. Now, these are not his pipes. These are pipes that were lent to me by my friend John Budgeon. But the rest of the organ is as Lord Rayleigh had it. And I can play each of these 8 notes in turn when I've got the wind pressure up to the right amount, and I'll just play them all one after another. You can hear the 8 notes, all more or less the same frequency. And the first thing to notice is that these 2 are much shorter than the others. And the reason is that these are stopped at the end. And you remember we said that if you have a closed pipe, it goes at half the frequency. Well, this is a very soft pipe. It's called a gedacht. These 2 are called stopped flutes. And they sound rather similar. The interesting thing that was pointed out by John when he was showing me these, he knew that I'm a Yorkshireman, and he said, this is a sort of southern type pipe with a nicely carved head, and this is a Yorkshire pipe with a champagne cork in the end. I don't know what the moral of that is, but there we are. Now this is a sort of basic pipe, a diapason type pipe, which produces the real body of sound in the organ. This is an interesting, rather archaic pipe. It's called a bell gamba, and it tapers in and then out again. And it gives a slightly thinnish sort of tone. This one, which has a little sort of knobble on the end there, a little roller thing, this one is called a string diapason. Again, rather a thin sort of quality. This is a voix celeste, and it's a little bit out of tune with the rest, and you have to play it with that one. And I think you'll find that there's a sort of wavery sound. And that, used in the right sort of places, can be rather pleasant. And this one is an English oboe. Quite a loud pipe, and if we look inside here in the boot, as it's called, we shall see that the reed is there. There's the reed. And this little piece of wire is for tuning the reed. And you not only have to tune the reed, but you have to tune the pipe to the reed, and you do that by opening and shutting this. So, those are the basic pipes that go into an organ. Now, let's just have a look at the mechanics of how an organ works. This is a representation of the wind chest in an organ. Air comes in there, and we don't want air to come through all the holes, so we have these devices which slide. And we're going to pull this one out, and so the holes in that row come in line with the holes at the bottom, and we get air to all 4 holes. Now we want to add the keys, and they have sliders going the other way, and if we press that key, this slider comes out, and we've got air through only 1 hole. And so by using combinations of stops and keys, you can get any hole you want. Well, now, a little while ago, when we knew we were going to do this, we thought it might be difficult to bring a complete church organ into the theatre. So, by the kindness of the rector, Monsignor Canon Miles, we were able to take cameras to St. James Spanish Place Church, and this is the result of our visit. Well, thank you. This is Terry Worrell, who's the Director of Music here at St James, and he's very kindly let me sit down at the organ so that we can talk about it. Well, the first thing to notice is that there are really not one organ, but 4 organs. 3 separate ones controlled by keyboards and another one controlled by the pedals. If I just play something on this central keyboard here, which we call a great organ, nothing happens. And that's because
there are no
there are no stops pulled out. Okay. So if I pull out, say, this one, which is an 8-foot stop, 8 foot is the normal pitch. But then I can go up an octave higher than that, and if I do the same thing on a 4-foot stop, and then we can go up to a 2-foot stop. And then there's another peculiar one. This is the 12th, which is an octave and a fifth, isn't it? So, and then perhaps if I play a chord, you could pull them out in succession. That's the 8-foot, 4-foot, 2-foot, and the 12th. Well, that's beginning to build up to organ tone, and those are all what you might call tin whistle type stops. I suppose that's an insult, really. But,
a sophisticated
tin whistles. Then there are also reed stops, and if we go over to these stops which control this manual, if I, for instance, pull out this one, that's a horn stop. Now this is on what's called a swell organ, and it's called swell. Why?
Well, because we can make a crescendo with it by opening the swell shutters.
And we'll go and see those later on.
Yes,
but for the moment, I'll just play a chord and then open the shutters with the pedal. And that not only changes the loudness, but it changes the quality.
It alters the quality of sound on some stops.
Yes, and this is one of the, I think, wonderful features of English organs,
yes,
the change of quality. Well, those are the basics. Now, I mentioned the swell box. There's also a box on the choir organ, which is down here and controlled by these stops. Now, of course, when the organist is in the middle of playing, he's using his hands and his feet, and then he wants to change stops. Now, that can be a complication. So
it can be very difficult on a large organ like this one.
So there's a way of doing this.
There's an easy way with pistons, which can give us a combination of stops.
So you just press a piston, and these are electrically operated.
They're electrically operated, and you can reach them with your finger.
Yes, and or your thumb underneath.
Yes.
Well, you can actually be playing and push a piston at the same time.
That's right.
And you can preset those so
right.
that if you're playing a particular piece, you could set them so that you can build up or change quality and so on as you go along. Good. Well, I think those are the main things that we want to talk about. Now I think what we'd like to do is to go inside the organ, and perhaps you could sit here, and I'll ask you to do various things, and we'll see what happens inside.
Right.
Fine. Well, this is the underside of the great organ. This is one of the wind reservoirs where the air is stored, and it goes up through these pipes. And these are the control rods. And if I could ask Terry just to play a little chromatic scale, you can probably see the rods moving. And now we'll go inside. Well, on this side we've got the great organ, and at the back you can probably see the tin whistle type pipes that I called them earlier on, and here are some of the reed pipes. Now there are a lot more pipes inside this box here. This is where the swell organ is, and I'm going to ask Terry to play a chord on a horn and then open and close the box so that we can hear the change in quality. we've seen the pipes inside the swell box, we'll go and have a look at the large pedal pipes. Well, these are some of the lowest pipes in the whole organ. These are the ones that Terry plays with the pedals. It's called a violone stop. And in a moment, I'm going to ask Terry to play a little descending scale. When we get down to this one, which is the bottom C, I'm going to put my hand in so that you can actually tell that it is this pipe that is playing. Now I'm going to put my hand in. You see it stops, take it out, and it starts up again. Well, there are well over 3,000 pipes in that organ. The lowest one we saw is about 16 foot long, and the highest one, this isn't it, this is a similar one, is only just about an inch long. You can see there's the hole where the air comes out, and that's the speaking length, and if I blow it, you may be able to hear it. Well, that's the highest sort of note that you'd ever get. Well, what have we done today? We've gone through a whole range of wind instruments, and I hope that the major thing that has come out from all of it is the enormous skill of the makers of organs and brass instruments and woodwinds and so on, the enormous skill of the players in matching their lips to what the instrument is trying to do. We've seen how a good player can absolutely dominate the instrument and do things that it's not really supposed to do at all. And we've also, I think, seen how incredibly clever the human brain is in helping the players to control what they're doing. And also, of course, we haven't said much about it, but in you, the listener, our brains have been working overtime, listening to all these sounds and working out what ought to be there, and so on and so forth. Well, in the next lecture, we're going to talk not about these sort of instruments, but about electronic instruments.